metrics, we'd really like to use quantitative data for that. So what are some things you can count about journals? One thing you can count is the number of articles that a journal produces. But productivity doesn't always mean quality, nor does using a carefully curated set of journals equate with quality of the articles. Another thing you can count is the publication frequency, and you can look at this as either how many times a year does this journal put out information, or how often has this journal been in publication. This, again, isn't a measure of quality at all. New journals are being added to the fields every year as new disciplines are being created. And just because a journal publishes often doesn't mean they're publishing great content. So the one quantitative metric that has been established is really indicative of the impact of a journal or even articles and authors is a number of citations to that item or to that journal. So looking at how many times has articles within that journal been cited can show the impact that that journal is having in scholarly literature. And before I get into measuring the specific, getting into the specific metrics of journal quality, I'm going to give a little bit of background on how citations are measured. And let me pause for a minute. I forgot to start the recording, so I'm going to do that.
I started it.
Thank you, Alex. All right, so we can get right into Science Citation Index. So this is a little historic background on how citation counts came to be. In 1955, Eugene Garfield proposed at a scientific symposium, wouldn't it be good to know where and by whom has this paper been cited in the literature? So science builds upon science, and knowing how someone has interpreted research would be helpful to further research along. Before 1955, it wasn't exactly easy to find this information out. So who has been citing what? So he received funding from the National Science Foundation and other sources. And in 1964, he published the first Science Citation Index using citation data from 1961. On the right side of the page, I've got a little graphic that shows who has owned Science Citation Index over the years, because if you look up Science Citation Index, you might see it associated with the Institute for Scientific Information, or ISI. This was a company created by Eugene Garfield to produce Science Citation Index. That was later purchased by Thomson Reuters, who was later purchased by Clarivate. So the current owner of this information is Clarivate, who also owns Web of Science and Journal Citation Reports, and some of the other resources I'll be talking about today. The first volume of Science Citation Index that was published in 1964 took citation data from a core group of 613 journals. And these are journals that cover all academic disciplines and were published in over 20 different countries to give a good look at the scholarly scope and worldview of the literature that's out there. So they pulled all of the references to articles that were published in 1961 in these 613 journals. And they came up with a total of 1,370,000 citations that were included in the reference lists. Once the Garfield and his team went through and found all the unique references, that 1 million went down to 890,000 unique references cited in articles published in 1961 in this core group of journals, and 258,000 unique first authors were cited. So they took this list of 890,000 unique references and then listed out when in 1961 were these articles cited. I've got a screen or a scan from the issue of Science Citation Index that was published using data in 1965 on the right side of the page. So you can see kind of what the layout looked like of this first volume of Science Citation Index. The top line, you'll see an article by Norfleet that was published in 1959 in the journal Urology, and it was cited in volume 81, page 737. So this article was referenced in 1965, and the indented line underneath shows which article referenced the article by Norfleet. If you look a little further down the page, you'll see an article by Norgard, and there's 7 different lines underneath this. So that article was cited 7 different times in 1965. So librarians purchased the Science Citation Index so researchers could come in and look at either their articles or well-known articles in their field, and they could see who's been citing this. And now you've got the citation information, so you can go forward and see, how is this item cited in the literature. This first volume was 5 volumes big and written at a 5-point font. So it was a lot of information and densely compacted into a print resource. And this was an enormous amount of work at the time. And when I think that it was done before Excel and before data processing, the majority of this was done by hand. And Garfield actually indicates that it wasn't really hard work, it was just tedious work, pulling together all this information. And Science Citation Index has been continually published since 1964. And today you can find it in Web of Science. So instead of being available in a print issue that's published every year, Web of Science continually is updated with the citation information as new journals are added and indexed in Web of Science. So from statistics from the 2020 Science Citation Index, over 9,500 journals are indexed and part of Science Citation Index, and it's got a total collection of over 1 billion citations and millions of unique references. So yes, Science Citation Index is continually updated. Each time articles are added to Web of Science, the citations are added to Science Citation Index, and you can search in real time to see when this information has been cited. So this is the source of citations and the citation counts that are used in a lot of metrics, and this is how it was first developed. So let's move on to journal metrics. And one of the first sources to provide metrics or of impact of journals is the journal citation reports. And this was another resource created by Eugene Garfield. This was introduced in 1975, and it's using that citation data from Science Citation Index. So Garfield was collecting, which authors are being cited, which articles are being cited, and he was also looking at which journals are being cited. And he surmised that articles or journals whose articles are being cited more frequently could have more impact than journals whose articles are cited less frequently. So he came up with a metric to measure this. And one metric he came up with was a journal impact factor. And also in the first issue of Science Citation Reports, you've got the immediacy index, which I'll talk about in a couple slides. Journal Citation Reports not only provides this information in an alphabetical view, as you see right here, an alphabetical list of journals, but you can also find the journals classified by discipline. So if I want to take a look at all of the mathematics journals to see how they're ranked, or the biophysics or the general and internal medicine journals, there's sections in Journal Citation Reports for those specific journals, so I can see how they stack up against each other. So the journal impact factor is calculated using citation data that's pulled from Science Citation Index. And in this 1975 issue of Journal Citation Reports, the metrics were calculated using citations to articles that were published in 1972 and 1973 and were cited in 1974. And all the pieces of information to calculate a journal impact factor are available on this page. So for the denominator, you're looking at how many items were published in this journal in 1972 and 1973. Journal Citation Reports qualifies the source items as citable items. So these are not letters to the editor or addendums or erratums. These are original research papers and review articles. So there's a count as to how many items were published. And then the numerator looks at how many times that same set of articles were cited in 1974. And you divide the two, and then there's your impact factor. So it's a pretty straightforward, easy to calculate number if you have access to this information. And this journal impact factor that was developed in 1975 is the same. We're using the same equation to get journal impact factors today. So you can go back and look at a journal historically, looking at their impact factor, and it's all the same metrics that have been used since its evolution. So here I've got a screen a screen clipping from the current journal citation reports. This was published in the summer of 2021 using citation data from 2020 and using items published in 2018 and 2019. I just think it's so interesting that we've advanced in the kind of computing power we have now, and we're still using this very simple, straightforward metric to measure journal impact. Journal citation reports has done and always grouped publications together by their discipline. So I can look at the Journal of General Internal Medicine and see how it stacks up against similar journals. And I've got a historical screen clipping from 1990 and then the current screen clippings from the 2020 JCR. So in 1990, the Journal of General Internal Medicine was listed as 21 out of 119 titles in the discipline of general and internal medicine. It's still ranking quite highly in that field today, so it's 27 out of 167 journals. And a new category was added at some point in time, called Healthcare Sciences and Services. And the Journal of General Internal Medicine in this category also ranks highly at 11 out of 107 journals in this category. And something to note is the Q1 designation for this journal. So journal and citation reports clusters journals into the top quartile, second quartile, third, and fourth. So if you find a journal that's ranked as a Q1 journal, it's in the top 25% of all journals in its category. Q2 is in this journal ranks in the top 50%. Here at MCW, we put a high value on journals ranked in Q1 journals. So if you're looking to publish, we put a value on you publishing in those Q1 journals, which equate with higher impact journals. There are some things to consider about journal impact factors and about all of the metrics I'm going to be talking about today. So one important thing to understand is that the quality of a citation is not measured. So citations to garbage articles, that gets the same count as a citation to a really well done article. One of the most highly cited articles in the field of autism and measles is Andrew Wakefield's article that purported to show a link between autism and the MMR vaccine. So this article has been highly cited because it has problematic methods. It created public health problems. So it's been cited a lot, but not because it was a great article. So quality is not measured, but impact doesn't always have to be about good things. So Andrew Wakefield's article created a lot of discourse in science, so that was impactful in its own way. Another thing to consider is the source of the citation data. So Web of Science, when they're calculating the journal impact factor, are using citations from those that appear in those 9,500 journals. So you're not getting every citation out there. The citations are limited to the resources that they collect citation data from. And then finally, journal impact factors in a lot of the metrics. You have to be careful how you compare between people or disciplines. A good example of this is looking at the scoreboard on the right side of the page. So if I mention that I went to a football game over the weekend and the score was 3-7, it's a different game if I'm talking about European football or soccer. A 3-7 score means a lot of action happened during that game. If I'm talking about American football, a score of 3-7 means it was a pretty boring game with just one touchdown scored and a field goal. So comparing these two sports using this one score isn't necessarily an accurate comparison. And here I'm showing journal impact factors for the top journals in the fields of general and internal medicine and biophysics. And you'll see in general and internal medicine, New England Journal of Medicine has an impact factor of over 91, whereas the top journal in the field of biophysics, which is Nature, Structural and Molecular Biology, has an impact factor of 15.369. These are two very different numbers, but these both represent the top journals in their field. Now, citation patterns between fields can differ quite a bit. So if you're looking at journals published and articles published in the field of internal medicine, the information is conveyed and acted upon quickly, and the citations happen rather rapidly. If you're looking at a basic science field like biophysics, it may take a while for some of these articles to make their way into the literature and be cited. So comparing outside of your discipline is not a good thing to do with this particular metric. Journal citation reports gives a couple of other additional metrics, and two I'm going to feature here are the 5-year impact factor. So instead of using 2 years of citation data, the 5-year impact factor uses 5 years of data. So this allows articles more time to be cited, and your 5-year impact factor is going to be higher than your 2-year impact factor. On the flip side is the immediacy index, and this is a looking at how many articles were published in the prior year and how many times they were cited in the prior year. So the immediacy index is really looking at how fast and quickly literature is being cited, and this number is always going to be smaller than the 2-year impact factor. Another new metric that was added into journal citation reports this year, or I shouldn't say another, it's a new metric was added into journal citation reports this year, and it's the journal citation indicator. And this is meant to be a normalized metric. So ideally or theoretically, JCIs, you can compare journals in 2 different fields with each other using this normalized metric. This metric isn't as easy to calculate as it is with the journal impact factor, where you're just dividing 2 straightforward numbers with each other. The journal citation indicator uses field normalized measures to find, let me see what the definition says. It's a field normalized measure of citation impact, where a value of 1 means that across the journal, published papers received a number of citations equal to the average citation count in that subject or category. So when you're looking at journal citation indicators, the big number to look at is how far away from 1 does this journal appear. So if it's very far away from 1, this journal performs higher and is cited more times than the average journal in the field. If it's less than 1, that means it's cited less than average in its field. So it'll be interesting to see if journal citation indicator takes off, as it's easier to compare journals across disciplines, but I'm not sure if it will, because it's not as easy to calculate as a journal impact factor, and the journal impact factor has been around for such a long time, people are pretty wedded to that particular metric. So I'm going to pause here and ask if you have any questions. I'm going to cover a couple other places you can find journal level metrics, but I'm interested to hear if there are any questions so far.
Feel free to unmute and ask questions, but if anything comes up during the session, feel free to throw them in the chat, and then we will get them.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, I see a question in the chat. Have journal level metrics become less valuable through the use of databases such as PubMed? I'm not certain. I feel like when people are picking journals to publish in, they're still looking at journal level metrics. So when they need to decide, should I publish in, Nature, or should I look to see if there's other journals that might be relevant for me? One factor that people consider is the metric, or the impact factor, or other characteristics of that journal. So yeah, I'm not sure that the metrics have become less valuable, particularly for deciding where to publish research. But that's an interesting question that I'm going to be thinking about after this presentation's over. Okay, so I covered the top bullet point on here. So journal citation reports is published by a vendor called Clarivate, who takes citation data from Web of Science or Science Citation Index to calculate their metrics. Pulling that citation metrics or citation data is requires a lot of access to journals, and it requires a lot of computing power and space to store all this information, but a lot of access to journals. So not a lot of companies and publishers are able to get that citation information and able to share it with people. So there's two main competitors to journal citation reports, and that's Scimago and Google Scholar. There might be others out there, but these are the two that I'm most familiar with. So these two resources, Scimago and Google Scholar, have their own ways of providing metrics that I'll go into in the next couple slides. So starting with Scimago, this again has citation data coming from Scopus, which is, these are both Elsevier products. Unlike journal citation reports, which you need to have a subscription to like MCW does, Scimago is freely accessible. So anybody can go in here and look up journals and look to see how they rank against each other. Scimago also classifies journals by discipline. So I can look at internal medicine journals and get a list of journals and see, you know, are they in the top quartile? Which journals perform better than others? So some of the metrics you can find in Scimago are the SJR, or the Scimago journal rank. And this is, some people have compared it to Google's PageRank, where if you, in Google's PageRank, it's the number of times things have been cited, but also the prestige of websites citing other websites provides a little more clout than, so some websites are more important than others. SJR recognizes this as well. So if your journal is being cited by New England Journal of Medicine versus the Journal of Library and Information Science, you're going to have a higher SJR. I'm sure they've published papers on how they come up with this number, but there's a lot of statistical stuff that goes on in the background that they're not real transparent about. So Scimago provides the SJR. And really what this helps with is comparing journals within a category to see how it ranks. You know, how is the SJR of Journal of General Internal Medicine compare with the one of Hospital Medicine. And SJR also provides Scimago also provides an H index for articles or for journals. So you can see how many times the number of H articles that have received at least H citations. I'm going to go into H index more when I talk about author metrics, but it's the same principle applied to journals. One thing about Scimago is they include many more publications than journal citation reports. So currently journal citation reports provides journal impact factors for over 9,000 journals that have to meet a sort of quality level. Scimago brings in many, many more journals, including a lot more open access journals. So if you're not able to get a journal impact factor for a particular title, you might find that information listed in Scimago instead. Google Scholar also provides some metrics for journals. This is another freely accessible database. And citation data comes from Google Scholar. So Google Scholar is able to collect citations to literature and store that information. And then they provide information about journals and how they measure up to each other. Scholar also categorizes things by discipline. So here I'm showing a short snippet from the category of health and medical sciences and a subcategory of primary healthcare. And Google Scholar uses the H index or H5 index to compare journals. And this is the H index for articles published in the past 5 years. So it's a little more shorter in time length than the entire H index for a journal. So these are additional places you can look to find journals, to compare journals with each other, and to see how they rank. You know, another source of this information is just to discover journals in your field. So you may not be aware of all the journals that are listed in the field of, you know, primary healthcare. So looking at this list can give you ideas on where you might want to publish. So that concludes my section on journal level metrics. I'm going to take a drink of coffee, but if you've got any questions, please feel free to speak up or put them in the chat. So the next two groups of metrics I'm going to be talking about, article level metrics and author level metrics, are metrics you might want to be aware of if you're trying to show what you've done or trying to show your research impact. So you can pick out articles that you've authored and show different metrics for them. Or as an author, you can use different metrics to show your overall impact. So these are metrics you might want to be aware of if you're going for promotion and tenure, or you know, you're applying for new jobs and you want to highlight some of your accomplishments. So starting out with citation counts, this is one way to show. You can pick some of your articles and show how often they've been cited. What I'm showing here is the same article and the citation counts. These were all pulled on the same day from 4 different sources, and you can see the difference in citation counts, and I'll try to give a little explanation of why there's differences. So I'll start with Google Scholar, or I'm sorry, Scopus in the top left. This particular article was cited 151 times, and Scopus provides a little information about how this ranks. So this is in the 99th percentile of all items cited in Scopus. So this would be, you know, it's kind of a badge of honor, I guess, to be cited that many times. And this 99th percentile can help you kind of show the impact of that article. Google Scholar has the same article being cited as 301 times. Google Scholar's citation metrics are like generally always inflated. And it's because Scholar isn't as picky as the sources of citation data that it's pulling from, whereas Scopus and Web of Science and PubMed are all pulling from journals that are indexed in their resources. So they're looking at, you know, articles that are published in peer-reviewed scholarly literature. Whereas Google Scholar takes anything that looks like a citation and gives you a point for that. So these could be things that are cited in documents or white papers that haven't gone through the scholarly publishing process. It pulls in a lot more foreign language articles. Sometimes you can also see citations that occur in PowerPoint slides or patents or things that look like they could be a citation. So these numbers are generally higher, and that's one reason why. Going down to Web of Science, this article has 144 citations within Web of Science, which is more similar to the 151 articles you see in Scopus. Like Scopus, I've got a little indicator that this is a high-performing article because there's a little trophy next to it. So this means it's a highly cited article within the field of, within its field. So that badge is something you can use to say, you know, this article is performing very well. Sometimes in Web of Science, you might see a little fire icon next to the article, and that indicates that it's a hot paper or it's being cited rapidly and quickly. And then lastly, I've got PubMed, and PubMed recently started adding these cited by information to article records. Here I've got 106 articles cited in PubMed for this, or PubMed's listing 106 articles citing it. It's important to know that in PubMed, they're pulling times that this was cited in articles that are in PubMed Central. So you're only getting those PMC articles, and it's a smaller portion of all the available literature out there. So this is not like the best number to use if you're looking at citation counts. Google Scholar is a great number to use, but if you're providing this information to anyone, it's really important to say when you pulled the data and which source it came from, so that if someone goes to check on it and they see 301, but they're not sure if you got this from Scopus or Web of Science, you know, they could not believe you and not, you know, have an accurate picture of what the information you're giving them. So again, if you're providing citation counts, it's important to say the date the information was pulled and the source that it came from. Another measure for article level metrics are metrics that are supplied by the publisher. So they can give you information on how many times an article was viewed on their website and how many times it was downloaded. So PLOS and JAMA do provide this. Not all journals do, but I think more and more are incorporating it into their systems. One thing I think is interesting is the way the graphs are made up, whereas PLOS has a cumulative graph, so it keeps adding. So the line keeps going up, whereas JAMA displays this as daily counts. So I can see this article right away when it came out was downloaded quite a bit, and it kind of slowed down after a while. And so now these, the next couple slides I'm going to talk about are alternative metrics. So it's looking more at not just how many times articles have been cited, but looking at the attention that articles have been getting on the internet. So I'm going to start with Altmetric here. And this is a badge that you can find for articles. Altmetric is a website that collects this information, and it looks to see, when and where have people been talking about your article that's been published. And it pulls from places like Facebook, Reddit, YouTube, Twitter, blogs, different news outlets, Wikipedia, patents. So it pulls from a lot of sources online. And Altmetrics kind of goes beyond scholarly literature. So how are real people in the real world talking about your article? On the right side of the page, you'll see, or I'm sorry, on the left side, an article that was published by me in 2019. And I did a little promotion of this article. So before it was published, I put out a press release that was picked up by Retraction Watch, who tweeted about it and talked about it on their blog. And then it got picked up by other sources. So I really helped myself bump up my Altmetric for this particular article by doing some promotion of it on my own. But also it was on a topic that is pretty, people talk about this topic quite a bit. So having a popular topic and doing self-promotion helped with my Altmetric score here. The article on the right side of the page has kind of an interesting history. So it was published in 2006 and by Dr. Jackson in Internal Medicine. And he said that this article kind of, flew under the radar until COVID hit, and they were looking for information on convalescent blood products for COVID. And this article was picked up by news outlets and highly referenced on the internet. So his Altmetric score kind of was level until 2020, and then it went sky high. So it just depends on, what's going on in the world. And if people find it and talk about it, then your Altmetric score goes up. I really like the donut that shows all the different colors to show kind of who's been talking about it and where. So you can see mine is really Twitter heavy, whereas the other one's more news focused. Another way to view alternative metrics is using PlumX, and this is produced by an Elsevier company. And PlumX shows kind of the same information. So who's talking about it on social media, where is it being downloaded from, who's mentioning it. And this little PlumX blob kind of changes depending on what your numbers are on the right side of the page. PlumX doesn't provide a score that you can use like Altmetric does. Oh, and let me go back a slide to this score. All these mentions are weighted. So a tweet gets less weight than a news outlet, YouTube or Facebook. Each of these companies has a weight assigned to it. So yeah, news outlets score higher than Twitter is basically it. And that's where, and the score comes from that type of information. So PlumX does not provide a score, but you can still look to see, who's talking about your article and why. And if you're going for promotion and tenure, you can say, my article has been cited and talked about by these people on social media in this way, and it's really had an impact in public health or, other things. So these PlumX and Altmetric information is freely available to see information about individual specific articles. At MCW, we don't have access to the back end, so you can't do kind of a collective sweep of all your articles and get that information in one report. So that concludes the article level metrics. Do you have any questions about that piece? Okay, then the last section I'm going to be talking about are author level metrics. So this is looking at one person and their research productivity. And actually I forgot to include, I added an additional metric in here this morning called the M-index that will be talked about after the H-index. So the H-index This was developed in 2005 by George Hirsch. So the H comes from Hirsch. And this equals the number of articles that have received at least that number of citations. So if I'm looking at this list of publications, I've got 10 different publications listed. My H index would be 5 because 5 of these articles have been cited at least 5 times. To bump my H index up to 6, I would need 6 citations from some of these articles down below. So this number is the longer that you've been publishing and the more information you've been publishing, the higher your H index is going to be. And it takes a while to collect these citations. So someone who published an article in 2020, getting 9 citations, that's pretty fast turnaround. But if your article is published in 2022, it may take a couple years for those to get cited. So H indexes reward researchers who've continually published and whose papers have been continually cited. So the longer you've been doing this, the higher the H index you'll have. Now, taking an H index score like this and looking at a department where you've got some people in the department who've been there for 30 years, and then you've got people who've been hired and just started in their career for 2 years, comparing apples to apples, that's a very unfair thing to do to researchers. So, if you're looking at a department and you're looking at H indexes, I would highly recommend clustering people either by academic rank or looking at how long they've been at MCW, and then comparing and doing some calculations to get a more accurate comparison of H indexes. Some people might limit citation counts to times the items have been cited in the last 5 years. This might make it a little more fair. So using a shorter time frame rather than all of the articles and all of their citation data since the beginning. One way to kind of take into account the differences in career lengths is to use an M index. And this is taking the H index, but dividing it by the number of years a researcher has been active. So in this case, if I've got my H index of 5, and it's been 9 years since my first publication, I have an H index of 0.55. You could do the same for people who've been publishing for 2 years or 30 years. And this might be a more fair level of comparison to those who've had shorter research times. So moving on from the M index, you've got a G index that was developed by Leo Egge in 2006. And this one's looking at the largest number such that the top G articles received together at least G squared citations. So what we're looking at essentially is the number of total citations and then taking the square root of that. So in this case, the same set of articles has a G index of 9 instead of a H index of 5. And what the G index rewards are these outlying articles at the top that have been highly cited. So this takes into account those high citations by looking at the complete and total citations to all of your works and then doing the square root of that. I don't see the G index used very often by people. I don't see it listed on their websites or, when people ask for information about promotion, I usually see H index, but not G index. This is an interesting number to have, but I'm not sure if you give it to someone, if they'll necessarily know what to do with it. The last author level metric I want to share is the I-10 index, and this was developed by Google Scholar, and it's the easiest of all to calculate. It's how many items have been cited at least 10 times. So in this case, my I-10 index is 3, because 3 articles have been cited at least 10 times. If you've got a profile in Google Scholar, they'll provide you with your H index and your I-10 index. So you can track your H index and your citation data across different platforms. And here I'm highlighting 3 places where you might want to take a look at your author profile and see how you're represented. So first of all, we've got Web of Science. So Web of Science automatically generates author profiles for people who've published and whose items have been indexed in Web of Science. So here I've got an author profile that Web of Science made for me, but then I went and claimed, and I added my ORCID ID to it, and I added a picture to it, and I was able to look through the publications and just affirm that they were mine. So in Web of Science, I've got 8 publications listed. I can see my H index of 3. I can see how many times the publications have been cited. And something new in Web of Science are these author beam plots right here. So the beam plots kind of show where my articles citations stack up against other items that were published in the same year at the same time. These beam plots are pretty new to Web of Science, so I'm still wrapping my head around how they work. But this is a new metric that can help you kind of see how your impact compares to others. Scopus also has automatically generated author profiles, and like Web of Science, you can go in and claim your Scopus record. I noticed in Scopus I had 2 records that I had to merge together. So I just sent an email to Scopus and they were able to get all my documents listed under one source. Here I can see I've got 12 documents that are indexed in Scopus, and I've got an H index of 3. So this information, it's available for anyone in Scopus who's published more than 2 articles, and they've been able to kind of automatically generate the author profile. If you'd like to claim it and clean it up, that's available to you to do. And then finally, Google Scholar has author profiling. So you can go into Google Scholar. Here you have to create this. So Google's not going to automatically generate one for you, but you can create your author profile. If you tie it to your institutional address, email address, then you'll get a verified Google Scholar profile. And here I can find my citations, my articles. I can clean up my works. I can add works that Google Scholar might have missed. And here I can see the number of citations and my H index and my I-10 index. So all of these profiles list a different number of publications and a different number of times cited, but I've got a 3 in each resource. So I think you'll find that the platforms all have pretty consistent metrics, especially in regards to H index. When you're sending information about your H index, like with article citations, it's important to say where you pulled it from and the date you pulled it. So whether you're pulling from Web of Science, Scopus, or Google Scholar, just let the person who's getting that information know the source of the data. And then this here is a chart of some of my articles, and then looking at citation counts in Web of Science, Scopus, and Google Scholar. And the NAs show that these articles aren't indexed in certain resources. So Web of Science doesn't pull in articles from the Journal of Hospital Librarianship. And Scopus doesn't pull in articles from Arthritis and Rheumatology. So relying on any one database to get this an accurate count of all of your citations is challenging because not all databases cover everything. So you can do a combination of these things. You can take citation data from all your sources and kind of merge it together and get your own H index or your own citation counts. But as always, it's good to show how you put that number together so people can replicate it and check to make sure that the numbers match up. So even though I've got different citation counts for all my articles, it still shows H index of 3 across all the sources. So it's a little early. I'm at the end of my presentation. There's 15 minutes left. So I'd love to hear any questions or comments about this. If you need clarification on anything I provided, or you have alternative metrics you might want to share with us or with the group, now's the time I can open it up for that. Okay, thank you for your question, Carissa. I see, are there best metrics to use for each of these levels? So the metrics, it depends on who you're looking at and who you're evaluating and how you're evaluating. So there's known metrics like journal impact factors, well known, but is that the best metric for your field? I guess it depends on what everyone else is doing and what the constraints are. When you're looking at author level metrics, I gave some instances where it's not necessarily fair to compare an H-index of a longstanding researcher to one of a newer researcher. So you've got to just be careful when you're using the metrics. You might want to incorporate something like the M-index. So I don't think that there's best metrics for anyone, like there's no single answer for anyone. It's just being aware of what you're counting, how you're counting, and making sure that it's equitable counting for all the people who's got stake in whatever the metric shows, if that makes sense. I've got some information on my research impact guide that talks about the ethics of using metrics. So there's different groups out there that have published papers about how metrics can be ethically used. So DORA is one of those places, DORA, and there's some other ones listed on our research impact guide. Perhaps Alex can share a link to that. But thank you. But that's something to keep in mind of when you're using any metric. And also, speaking of that research impact guide, it's got a lot of the information about the metrics that were talked about in this recording. And I'm still open to questions. I just wanted to highlight that the library has upcoming classes. So every month we do classes on PubMed, how to use PubMed, and the library orientation. So the next up are March 23rd and April 21st. You can find links to these on our classes page on our website. And then in the Scholarly Communications webinar series, I've got a session coming up soon about research data management. So if you're at all working with data and files, this research data management might be for you. It's got some tips on how to start practicing good data management. And also we'll be talking a little bit about NIH's new requirements for sharing data. I'll also be talking about tracking scholarly input for your department. So if you're collecting publications for your department, in this session, I'll be offering different sources you can use to collect that data and kind of harness it and keep track of it over time. And then in June, we'll be talking about open access. So I've got a panel discussion on June 16th with people who've published in open access journals. So you can ask questions on how they went through it, how they got funding, what their views are on open access. So I hope you'll join us for more of those series. And also please fill out the evaluation link that Alex provided here. It's the first in a series of webinars, and I just want to make sure that we're hitting the right points and that we're being relevant to the MCW community. So I will stay on. If you've got questions or comments about impact, please feel free to share. Okay, thank you everybody and have a good Thursday. I'm going to end the meeting now. Goodbye.